the friction between Stan Watie and John Ross. They had a long-standing rivalry between the two of them. Watie was the only Native American to rise to a general's rank in the Confederacy during the war. I've read some places he was the only Native American to rise to that rank for the North or the South in the entire Civil War. So the reason that he joined the Confederacy was because he was scared that the government was going to make a state out of Oklahoma, and lo and behold, they ended up doing that. The majority of the Cherokee Nation initially voted to support the Confederacy in the Civil War. Even though less than a tenth of the Cherokees owned slaves, they were, so, for the most part, from other sources I've read, they were not, as a people, opposed to slavery. They had kind of a culture in the past of holding in bondage like captives of war. So slavery was not a foreign notion to them. They had, from other sources I've read, but always do your own research, they had actually held slavery, before the Europeans introduced the idea of African slaves here. So they had enslaved other tribes in battle. So they, as a people, were not opposed to slavery. So in October of 1861, he was commissioned as a colonel in what became the first Cherokee Mounted Rifles. At the time he was fighting the federal troops, the Union troops, he also led his men in fighting between the two groups of Cherokees that were at war with each other. Remember how I said the Cherokee people were on the verge of their own civil war? Well, it pretty much for a brief time turned into one. So he led his troops in attacks on Cherokee civilians and farms. And we all know he burned Baptist Mission over there because they were anti-slavery. So more on that later. But he fought against Creek, Seminole, and others in Indian Territory who chose to support the Union. And as time went on, more and more Cherokees switched from support of the Confederacy to support of the Union. So Watie is noted for his role in the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas. He was under the overall command of General Benjamin McCulloch, and I gotta look at my notes to remember these names. Watie's troops captured Union artillery positions and covered the retreat of Confederate forces from the battlefield after the Union took control. But later, most of the Cherokees who had joined Colonel John Drew's regiment actually switched to the Union side. So, as time went on, he lost support. The Confederacy in the South, especially in Indian Territory, began to lose Cherokee support. So, Watie continued to lead the remnant of his cavalry. He was promoted to Brigadier General by General Samuel Bell Maxey on May 10th of 1864. He commanded the 1st Indian Brigade of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, composed of 2 regiments of mounted rifles and 3 battalions of Cherokee, Seminole, and Osage infantry. These troops were based south of the Canadian River and periodically crossed into Union Territory. They fought a number of battles and skirmishes in the western Confederate states, including Indian Territory, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas. Watie's forces reportedly fought in more battles west of the Mississippi River than any other unit. Watie took part in what is considered to be the greatest and most famous Confederate victory in Indian Territory, which was the Second Battle of Cabin Creek. It took place in Mays County, Oklahoma on September 19th of 1864. He and General Richard Montgomery Gano led a raid that captured a federal wagon train and netted approximately $1 million worth of wagons, mules, commissary supplies, and other needed items. $1 million back then was just an unheard of amount of money. That was insane. So he captured something of huge wealth back then. Black eye on Stan Watie. Stan Watie's forces massacred black hay cutters at Wagner, Oklahoma during this raid. Union reports said that Watie's Indian cavalry, and I'm just going to read this straight from Wikipedia, it says, Watie's Indian cavalry killed all the Negroes they could find, including wounded men. So, he was pretty harsh. Since most of the Cherokee were now Union supporters during the war, General Watie's family and other Confederate Cherokee ended up taking refuge in Rusk and Smith counties of East Texas. So he moved his family down there. I believe it was with that last wife. The last name was Bell. And Sally was her name, and she had children down there, and she had written him a letter saying that they were living in just extreme poverty. She didn't have grease to fry in, and the kids had no clothes. They were naked. So times were pretty bad while they had to kind of defect down to Texas. Some of the Cherokees that had to go to Texas, they took their slaves with them and ended up hiring out the slaves to other people who worked them. There was even some really bad cases of where some of them ended up killing slaves that they couldn't afford to feed. Again, that's on some other referenced sites, and I don't have the reference for that offhand, so you might look up and do your research on your own. I've heard my dad tell some stories about some slaves being hung not too far from where I grew up, and again, that was just handed down stories. It's nothing that can historically be proven. It was kind of almost a spooky bedtime story he would tell us sometimes. So more on that later when we talk about some other families around here and some other of the Cherokee historical figures who came in. And there's a historical marker on some of it that actually is not too far from where I grew up. So we'll talk about more of that later. But I've even heard some trickle-down stories on some of the slaves being mistreated. You don't know how much to believe and how much not to believe. Some of that stuff is so hard to prove. So I don't want to say something that's not completely historically accurate, but there was another site on a periodical where I read some stories about some of the Cherokee people during this time when a lot of the Cherokee went and supported the Union. The few that did hold slaves, some of them ended up treating them badly because it was really, really hard times for everybody. So not excusing it or promoting it, just repeating what I've read happened. So after they took refuge in Texas, the Cherokee and allied warriors became a very potent Confederate fighting force that kept Union troops out of southern Indian Territory and very large parts of North Texas through the war. But they spent most of their time attacking other Cherokee, because remember, at that time, the other Cherokees were, as a whole, becoming anti-slavery and were in support of the Union, just like we talked about with Baptist Mission and how they were considered kind of the seat of anti-slavery in Indian Territory at the time. And so many, many Cherokees were actually ended up on the Union side, as did Chief John Ross. So the Confederate Army put Watie in command of the Indian Division of Indian Territory in February of 1865. But the Confederates were no longer able to fight in the territory effectively. By June 23rd, 1865, at Dopesville, in the Choctaw Nation, which is now Oklahoma, Watie signed a ceasefire agreement with Union representatives of his command. The 1st Indian Brigade of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi. I thought this part was interesting. He was the last Confederate general in the field to surrender. So he really held true to his name, stand firm or standing firm, stand Watie. He held on to what he believed to the bitter end. So after that, after his demobilization, Watie went to Texas to see his wife Sally. Remember, they lived briefly in Texas when things got rough on the Indian Territory, and they mourned the death of their son, whose name was Comiskey, and he had died at 15, and that's sad. And I don't know what happened to him. I've tried to figure it out, and I've looked, but I can't find it. So after the war, Watie was a member of the Cherokee delegation to the Southern Treaty Commission, which renegotiated treaties with the United States. So John Ross, jumping back to John Ross, we're going to talk more about him next week. He had signed an alliance with the Confederacy in 1861. So he had initially said he was going to support the Confederacy in the Civil War. So had a lot of the other Indian Territory Indians. They were in support of the Confederacy because they were trying to avoid a civil war within their own tribe. But within less than a year, Ross and part of the Cherokee Nation government said that that agreement was disastrous. So Ross removed the tribal records to Kansas and proceeded to Washington to meet with President Lincoln. So after Ross went to Lincoln and kind of renounced his support of the Confederacy, Tom